Thank you, Martha, and good afternoon, good Wednesday afternoon to our Listen and Be Heard uh, audience. It is a wonderful, wonderful day, and we have another author, this time a local author, a local poet, Karen Luke Jackson. And I'm very excited about this because this is a wonderful, wonderful book. She is the author of The View Ever Changing. I'm going to read from her bio. Karen Luke Jackson draws upon oral history, contemplative practices, and the natural world for inspiration. Her poems and stories have appeared in numerous journals, including Ruminate, Broad River Review, One, Friends Journal, Channel Magazine, Emery's Journal, and Leaping Clear. Her debut poetry chapbook, titled Grit, and that's with a capital G, Grit, published by Finishing Line Press in 2020, chronicles her sister's life as Clancy the Clown. Karen also co-edited with Dr. Sally Z. Hare, The Story Mandala, Finding Wholeness in a Divided World. She is a member of the North Carolina Poetry Society and the North Carolina Writers Network. Karen, welcome to our program.
It's a pleasure to be here, Tony. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
Yes, it's really wonderful that you're here with us today. Being a local poet. You live in Hendersonville.
I do. I've lived in the area 45 years, but
Mm-hmm.
right now I live in Flat Rock in a cottage on a goat pasture.
Flat
So,
Rock is just down the street from where I live, actually.
right.
And I think, yeah, you and Jennifer Magaha have that in common, the goats.
Yes, we do.
The
And,
view, oh, go ahead.
no, I was going to say, and we're only a stone's throw from Carl Sandburg, which is another renowned place for goats. So the Carl Sandburg National Historic Site.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. The view ever changing. I really had a wonderful time reading these poems. I felt like I was on a journey of the life of a poet. Now, the book is a journey really across the terrain of the poet's eye, and from the rear view to the present, to what might lie ahead. What was it about poetry that brought you to it, or it to you?
What was it about poetry?
Yeah.
Uh, Well, the interesting thing about this book was that I had also been working on a memoir for 10 years or so, and I would be writing these vignettes,
Uh-huh.
and then I would end up writing a poem about the same thing I had written about in prose, and the poems were better than the prose.
Oh,
So,
I see. Yeah.
and the poems also improved the prose. So it sort of began to develop that way. And then as I began to put the stories together, other poems emerged. So it's been a labor of love.
Yeah, the poems, some of them read almost like short stories, kind of it has the compression of the language, yet in the form that you're writing it, it's some of them are very a narrative, but very very poetic. um you had mentioned, or at the front of the book, I think there's a quote here. Let me see if I can find this. It was a quote by Joy Harjo, and what she says is, "Remember the sky that you were born under." Uh, Setting is very, very prominent and very strong in your collection. There's a use of personification that leads leads a voice, or lends rather a voice, to the places you inhabited as a child, and that place being Georgia. Um, Tell us about Georgia and how that figures into your poetry, because you share a lot of heartfelt and personal things. Can you tell us about Georgia? Tell us about that setting, that place.
Well, I grew up in rural South Georgia in a little town that was about 2,000 people.
Mm,
And I grew up in a large extended family. And that's the reason Joy Harjo's poem, Remember, was such an important poem for me, because these poems are about remembering the stars under which I was born. Because I grew up in a rural community, farming community, and the land was very important, very sacred. Um, and yet there were a lot of also things about South Georgia and the rural South at that time I was growing up that was not good too. So I have sort of a love-hate relationship with
Yes, yes.
my whole upbringing there. And that's what these poems sort of work through as it progresses from the memories from childhood, my barefoot summers, as I call them,
Mm.
all the way to speaking on behalf of the land in the last section, the more global kind of sense of caring for the earth and respecting our grandmothers and looking at where we're being led in the future. So,
Yeah, there's a term um that you use that, hold on a second. It's a I'm kind of drawing a blank, but you describe yourself in this, there's a term, I think it's an old Irish term. Um it's
you
kind
mean
of like,
in my biography? You mean
yes, it's
sort of an autumn cara?
that's it. That's it.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Can you
That
talk about what that is? And if you can repeat that again for our
Okay.
listeners.
Well, I actually came across that term with John O'Donoghue's writing, who was an incredible Irish poet.
Hmm.
And the Celtic tradition had this idea of soul friends.
Soul
These are
friends.
people who walk through life with you or you encounter in life, and they become a soul companion to you. And what I did not know growing up, but what I've learned as I've learned more about the Celtic tradition is, and this comes out of Janis Ray's writings, who's a wonderful author from South Georgia, that a lot of the people who settled that area of Georgia were of Celtic stock. And the Celtic tradition sees the land as sacred and imbued with healing properties. So yes, so I've been blessed with soul friends in the journey, not only in my life's journey, but in my journey about writing poetry. Because
Yeah,
as
I
I
mean
say, yeah.
that's pretty clear in the writing,
Mhm.
um, in the subject matter and the real strong sense of place and setting. In what ways have you seen a desecration of that? Because I know that there has been, and I know that there's a real honoring in the poems about what did come before, and some of those things that can't really be forgotten, that are brought to the forefront in your work.
Well, when I grew up, the a lot of the new agricultural practices were coming into play, and now we know that's been a poisoning of the land. So I know there's a poem called Elegy for My Childhood Trees, which is about recovering that sense of what the trees meant to us when we were growing up as children. I know that the power of place comes across a lot in the triptych poem, the triptych on the anniversary of my mother's death,
Mm-hmm.
which was a poem that I was really pleased that the Broad River published, and it received the Rash Poetry Award. But it's about those three generations, and it's very involved with what the land is about. Um, and then toward the end, there's even a poem, a persona poem, where the seedlings, the longleaf pine ecosystem is the primary ecosystem in South Georgia. And it's where the seedlings of these pine trees are speaking.
Mm, yes.
And so, so that was very important to me. Um,
Well, I'm going to ask you to read a poem during the interview. Uh, it would be great if you could read the elegy for childhood trees, but any poem that you'd like
okay.
to read is fine. Is fine. Um, there's also a playfulness as well. You have poems in there about snuff,
Oh
about
yes. Oh yes.
you know about about the women
Yeah.
in your life, the older women who were dipping snuff
Yeah.
because it was unladylike to smoke, I guess, to be
Right.
seen with cigarettes. And I think that the young kids were imitating that by using powdered chocolate, or there was something in there,
Mm.
but
The
it just
snuff
shows.
poem, yeah, it's a favorite of a lot of people who grew up with older relatives who used to dip snuff. The women used to dip snuff.
Mhm.
That was a fun poem to write.
Yeah,
Very
yeah.
much
I
so.
got a sense of that as I was
Yeah.
reading that. And since we're on the subject of elders, talk about the role of elders in your work. What is your inheritance as a poet from those that have come before? What is your inheritance, and what do you hope to give the current generation, or to give people that perhaps didn't have that type of experience? What kind of knowledge would you think or like to impart?
Oh, Tony, that's a fabulous question. I I think really the elders that I grew up with, they weren't big readers, nor were they poets,
Hmm.
but they were storytellers. And they had these pithy sayings often that once I got on my own spiritual journey and I would discover some of the scholars that the wisdom these elders had that came from the lives they had lived and from living close to the land very much resembled what the theologians were saying in a little bit more elevated language. So the gift for the elders that I grew up with is very much that whole tradition of storytelling. But I also think about elders in my work when I've led contemplative retreats, because for about 20 years I led contemplative retreats for clergy and educators and nonprofit leaders, and we use poetry in those retreats. So I think about the poets that I came to love in those retreats, like Mary Oliver and Wendell Berry and William Stafford and David White. And so, in some ways, I don't know them personally, but I feel like there also have been elders to me in terms of writing poetry from the heart.
What did you get out of Wendell Berry? Because I'm a very big Wendell Berry fan. I love his poetry, and I love his essays. I think his essays are very poignant and very uh, very incisive. What did you get from him? I mean, he wrote a book of essays. It was called "What Are People For?" You just love you just love the title. What was it about him that
Well, for
attracted you?
me, his poems about Sabbath
Hmm.
and how we and his poems about the sacredness of being in a grove of trees, his just deep relationship with the land was where I connected with Wendell Berry and his poems, and that plea for future generations, and yet that whole sense that um we can only do what we can do in this moment in time, and part of that is also to consider the land holy, and our role as being it's more than stewards. We need to realize that we are of the earth, which is a
Exactly. I mean
yeah,
that I
right.
think that's a big thrust of his work. I know that you were part of the Great Smokies, writing program. That you're a friend of Jennifer McGaha, who we had the privilege of interviewing a while back, and her about her memoir Flat Broke with Two Goats. And one of the things that she writes that I think resonates with what you're doing. She writes, "What season of life are we in? How do we find our way from one season to the next? And what do we do with the moments in between?" Tell us about your writing practice, how how you come about or stumble upon your poems, where they come from, how you cultivate your craft.
I have been very blessed with lots of Great Smoky writing classes. They have been just a wonderful source of inspiration for me. I think I told you sort of how the View Ever Changing came to be, because it was sort of poems written in concert with when I was writing vignettes and memoir pieces about South Georgia. But the Grit book, which was the first chapbook that I ever published, was directly as a result of a Great Smoky Writings class. I went in there and I was determined to write. My sister had died 6 months before the class began, and I went in there determined to write some poems in response to a wonderful book by Robin Wall Kimmerer called Braiding Sweetgrass. So I had my whole design in my head as to how I was going to use the class. And we got an assignment that asked us to write about household objects. And
Hmm.
I resisted. It was like, what am I doing? But I ended up writing several poems about shoes, and one happened to be clown shoes. And the class said, we
Right.
want more clown poems. And so I don't care
Oh man.
what the assignment was for 10 weeks, whatever the assignment was, a clown poem would emerge.
Hmm.
So I part of my practice is to be in community, to be in a critique group, to see where my inspiration is coming from, and so I realized that I ended up writing this book as a way of both grieving my sister's death and honoring her creative genius.
And this is the cover right here.
Right. And that is of
Yeah,
Clancy the clown,
Nancy
who
the clown
was
is on the cover.
right.
Um, your sister's name was Janis,
Yes.
and Grit. Well, I guess you can go into detail about what the significance of the title Grit is. Um, the story of your sister, while it's tragic, it I get a sense that there's a true honoring of her and a reconciliation on your part to lend some grace and to apply that grace to her life, because I get a sense that perhaps she may have been misunderstood at times. Can you talk about your sister and this book and the difficulty that you had writing it, or perhaps there was something unexpected that came in the process of writing it, that maybe there were some epiphanies that happened? Can you talk about Grit?
Yes. My sister had dyslexia as a child, so she
Mm,
always struggled. It was very hard for her to read, unlike I was able to read easily and school came easily for me. So she sort of ended up becoming more like an actress or a clown, even as a child, to sort of cover up for that dyslexia. But throughout her life, she also struggled with depression. At one time was diagnosed as bipolar. So she really ended up, though, rising above that to use her creative genius and this whole sense of her imagination. It was an imagination, as I say, in one of the poems, that it was almost like a Walt Disney imagination. She
mm,
created whole towns and whole villages in her
right.
mind and made them so real. Her town was Smileville. Clancy was the mayor of Smallville, that the children would ask how they could get there. They would ask for directions to this town. And the people loved her. They loved her clown. And she created an imaginary world that just brought so much joy to people. I wanted people to, I wanted to celebrate that for her. And she did it despite all she was struggling with.
Yes, there's a poem in the collection about, I think there was a little boy that contacted her
Hmm.
and wanted to know how he could get to
Do
that
so.
certain town, right?
Yeah,
And
reality check.
yeah,
Yes.
and which kind of brings up the whole process of breathing life into a poem and honoring the people and the places that you're honoring, because your sister took on a persona. And as writers, that's what we're doing. We're dealing in character, we're dealing in setting, and all of those things bring us personas. And as writers, we don't inhabit just one persona. I mean, we have many, many different personas. Can you discuss that as well? Because there's so many things in this book about people and places, and how do you inhabit all these different personas, yet yeah, yet be yet remain true to your poetic voice.
Okay. Um, this book is written in lots of different voices, and I'll tell you when the breakthrough came. I had about half of the poems written at the end of that class. I had the opportunity to study with Pat Revere Seal in the Gilbert Chapel Distinguished Poets series, and I was trying to see how I could get more of these poems to convey my sister's true character. And she recommended a book, and I have it with me, Magnolia by
Mm,
A. Van Jordan, which was a narrative of a young woman's journey through life. And she was a runner up to the National Spelling Bee. And he wrote the poems from different voices. And so Pat suggested I look at this book. And that's when the breakthrough came for Grit, is that I could use other people, not just my voice, to tell my sister's story. So in this book, there's a narrator that sort of advances the story. There are her fans. My mother has a poem in it. I have a couple of poems in my own voice. Her husband talks about what it was like to live with her. And then she herself has poems in her voice telling that story about that young boy that called her after a elementary school performance. The reason this was easy for me was because every time I would go to South Georgia, she would tell these stories over and over again. Because she wasn't a reader, her whole tradition was oral. And I had
okay.
heard these stories so many times. I didn't have to create the voices. I just had to remember them in my head.
Yes,
Is that
yes,
helpful?
yes, yes.
And
And beautiful and beautiful too, you know, that that you had the oral tradition, and you had the musicality of the voice, and you
yes,
had the urgency. It just seems like, even after she passed on, there was still an urgency in you to reflect. I mean, that one poem about the boy, it was it was sad, and it felt tragic, yet at the same time I felt like Janis had really offered something that was real, even though it was another part, it was her persona. What she offered was something that was real, that was beauty, that she was making art. And she shaped the art from herself, and I guess the art came from her pain too, in some
it
ways.
did. In fact, that is one thing she really communicated. And I think there's another poem in defense of clowning in
Mm-hmm.
the book that's in her voice that names some of the clowns, because most clowns, and she had a lot of colleagues, including one man who had been the advance man for Ringling
Yes.
uh, Circus for 8 years, who helped coach and mentor her. And most clowns say there is pain in a lot of the clowns who are clowning. And they convert that, they transform that pain into something that brings joy to other people.
Yeah, I when I think of clowns, really, I one of the first things I think about maybe is Ringling Brothers, and it was that Smokey Robinson song, "Tears of a Clown."
Right.
I think the line was like Pagliacci did. He kept his sadness hid. You see, like Pagliacci did. I tried to keep my sadness uh, uh, hiding from the public eye, but in the lonely room, I cried the tears of a clown.
Yeah.
Right, right. Um, you use the word gravity in the title of one of your pieces from The View Ever Changing, the word gravity. And it is a powerful poem. I was wondering if you could read that one, or whichever one you want, whichever poem you know what, the Elegy for Childhood Trees is beautiful too. If we could, have you read one of your poems for our listeners.
Well, the gravity poem is a dictionary poem, so it doesn't read with quite as much musicality as
Okay,
Elegy
okay,
for
yeah,
Trees.
sure, sure.
But I really wanted to try. That was another thing in that book. I wanted some different forms. And so I had gotten really fascinated by dictionary poems. So I was able to do a couple of those that I thought worked. But
Yeah.
I think in terms of this, Elegy for Trees might be the one to read. Okay.
Okay.
Elegy for Childhood Trees. The live oak, home to a wooden horse swing, showered acorns on pink azaleas. Beside the kitchen window, a mimosa bloomed. My sister picked puffs and pretended to powder her face before gliding down a make-believe runway. A Bartlett dressed white in spring dropped yellow globes midsummer. Mama boiled and packed pears in mason jars for a taste of sunshine in December. And a kefir my grandmother planted at the old home place, stooped with ripening fruit, stretched its branches like an arthritic hand. Plum crazy, my grandmother would say, if she could see the poisoning of land, clear cutting of trees. For in her day, pecans lined dirt roads, their green sickle leaves cloaking velvet husk that burst to reveal tawny shells. If nuts were slow to fall, we threw sticks, shook limbs. In piney woods, gum tapped by descendants of slaves yielded turpentine for sealing ships, dabbing wounds. Cypresses shaded swamps and brackish ponds, their knees rising from muddy graves, feathery needles harboring snakes as boats oared by. Magnolias wore sugar blossoms the size of dinner plates. Bloom's grandmother warned us not to touch, lest they brown and wilt.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that. In other places in the book, you speak of the death of, I think, the death of your father, the death of your mother. That cycle of life. How difficult was that to breach in terms of a subject for poem?
The poems made the grieving possible.
Mm, mm. Yes,
I
yes.
remember the prayer for my father
Mhm.
that's in the book,
Yes,
prayer that he die.
yes.
I
Yeah,
actually wrote,
yes.
I actually wrote in their home as we were waiting for him to die. So I turned to writing to to weather the caretaking I was doing for my parents.
Mm. Which makes total sense, and that it really comes through in the book. One other question I wrote here was, and I'm not sure if this makes any sense. I'll read it anyway. It says your book includes an obituary of your sister, but in another sense, the poems are obituaries that give life or assert it. What message do you want your readers to come away with as you guide them through the pages?
Well, that's in my sister's book about grit, right?
Mm-hmm.
The obituary. Give me the question, the last part of the question again.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if that made quite
It
what
does.
message
I just want to
what
hear it
oh
again.
what message do you want your readers to come away with as you guide them through the pages?
Mm. I think there are two messages, and I hadn't thought about this. That's a interesting question. The first message that just popped into my mind is that um, life is to be celebrated, even with the pain. Life
Yes,
is to be celebrated. That's what
yes,
Clancy would say.
yes, yes, yes,
Okay,
yes, yes,
celebrate life.
yes.
And then the other thing I think that probably comes through more in The View Ever Changing is that there are two things, because this book, in the end of the first section, there's a poem about leaving South Georgia. And then later on, it's about the pilgrimage back to South Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
So it's that message, I think, is more about, we are formed by our place and our people. And so it's a book that tries to also lift up the fact that we need to somehow um, make conscious choices that bring us into better harmony, both with our people and with the earth that we are calling home.
And that really does tie into writing because they all always talk about choices. You're making choices to use this character or use this this metaphor, and also what you're saying about how we are formed by our environment. There's a writer in the MFA program that I just graduated from in Vermont College. I don't know if you have read Clint McCown, but he's a writer from Tennessee, and one of his lectures he talks about setting. It's a lecture called the hydrogen atom of fiction. It's
Oh.
all about setting, and it was kind of funny. He said, well, he says if you look at the Adam and Eve story, he says if you take Adam and Eve out of the garden, basically what you have is just a story of a bickering couple. And then he said, this is funny. He says, hey, you take Noah out of the ark, and what do you have? You just have a deranged old shipbuilder. So he just talks about how setting really, and how a character interacts with setting, sets the plot a sail. I mean, essentially. Before we get off, because we are running low on time, can you just tell us the story behind the title, Grit?
Oh, it was the poem in there. Grit is the poem that chronicles my sister's nervous breakdown and hospitalization, and then her making the choice to go to a clown convention 2 years later. And that poem showed that she just had to dig down deep inside herself, and she had grit to be able to overcome.
Yes.
And when I was pulling it together, several people said they felt like that was the sort of the turning point in the story, and that's the reason I chose that title poem as the title, Grit.
Well, you have some really fine work here. Again, this is Listen and Be Heard Radio. You're listening to WPVM 103.7 FM, the voice of Asheville. Karen Luke Jackson, a pair of wonderful books, The View Ever Changing, a collection of poems, another poem chapbook of poems called Grit, and this wonderful book was published by Finishing Line Press in Georgetown, Kentucky, and it's dedicated to the memory of Janis Luke Roberts, 1952 to 2016. And there under that is a line from Psalm 71, verse 7, a wonder unto many, Grit. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. It was just a pleasure speaking with you, and the fact that you're a local writer. We talk to writers from all over the place, but we really want to pay special attention to writers that are from the area. You're just down the street from me, actually, Flat Rock. I mean, I could probably walk backwards and get to your house in like 15 minutes. We're going to have coffee one of these days, very, very soon.
Well, I want to just say we have a wonderful community of writers in Western North Carolina. I couldn't be any more blessed. And we're so glad you decided to move here, Tony.
Oh, yeah,
because
yeah.
we needed you more than California and San Francisco. So
San
thank you for
Francisco.
being here.
Well,
Yeah.
from Carolina, what do I always say? From Carolina from the Carolinas to California and back. But Karen, before we part, can you tell us, or tell our WPVM listeners who are interested in getting your book, if there's a website, how they can get in touch with you online?
Well, I have a website, KarenLukeJackson.com. And the books are available at all the bookstores, through Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and the publishers, both Finishing Line Press and Kelsey. So I appreciate anybody who would love to read them, and I just appreciate your having this conversation with me about them. And I'm excited about the new book that's coming out from Red Hawk this fall, and I know you've got one in the works there too. So
oh yeah, about working in the thrift stores.
right.
And the thing is, I'll know if that book is a true success if one day I'm perusing the aisles of a thrift store and I happen to see it on a thrift store shelf.
That's true.
Then I'll know. But anyway, again, thank you so much, Karen. Again, this is Karen Luke Jackson, Luke as in cool hand, okay? Karen Luke Jackson, the author of the poetry chapbook Grit, and that's spelled Grit, and The View Ever Changing. And this is a wonderful collection of poems. Thank you so much, Karen. And that being said, we're going to toss it back to Martha in the studio. Martha, Take it away. And what I'd like you to do, Karen, if you could read a couple more poems, because what we can do is we can insert it
Okay.
during the show. We can insert that. So
So
whichever ones you want to.
do you want me to read the reality check about the Velveteen Rabbit and the little boy, or do you think that's too heavy?
That's a hell of a piece. I really like that one.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay. And the other one that people like is Clown Shoes because
clown shoes. Yeah, you know
it's
what?
a
If you could,
persona poem in the. I mean, I never thought about writing in the voice of shoes, but I did it.
yeah, I mean, that's what I liked about it is you're kind of you're taking on that voice, and you're kind of getting into that world, and it's.
Okay, well, let me read
Mhm.
those two, and then the other one or two I could read. Deconstructing Goldilocks won the Sidley Lanier Prize, and it's a favorite of people's because it's in the women's section. And then the triptych on the anniversary of my mother's death won the Ron Rash Poetry Prize.
Oh, deconstructing Goldilocks. Yeah,
Yeah, and then
yeah.
that triptych poem won the Ron Rash Poetry Award. So
One of these days I'm going to have Ron Rash on this program because I like his short stories. I can't say anything.
his
I
poems
can't
are
I can't
better than
say enough. What's that?
his poems are great.
Oh,
I didn't
I
even know
haven't.
I didn't even know he wrote poetry till I went to the Looking Glass Writers Conference and studied with him, and he was teaching us poetry. They're
Yeah,
amazing.
yeah. Okay. Well, I tell you what. Why don't you go ahead and read them, and then yeah.
Okay, I'll read the two from Grit, and then I'll at least read one or two, and then you can use what you want. Okay.
Okay. Sure thing.
You want me to do any introduction to it? Just a little bit?
Um. Well, you could say this is from the book.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, so I'll be reading Clown Shoes from Grit, and it's a persona poem in the voice of the shoes. Clown Shoes. You should have seen that gal when she tried us on at the dealer's table, waving her arms like a windmill, tripping over our laces, falling forward. She soon steadied, strode with a loping gait, our flopping toe boxes a world of rainbows and crayoned hearts that delighted children. With each goofy step, her real heart cracked open, inch by inch, wearing her out, us too. She was buried in her clown costume, barefoot. We still live in her walk-in closet. And this poem is Reality Check. It was a poem written about an encounter my sister had in her and I start that over.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. This is Reality Check, and this is a poem in my sister's voice after an elementary school performance. I was home washing clothes when the phone rang. Miss Janis, the child said, is Clancy around? I'd told the kids that Janis was Clancy's manager, although sometimes it seemed the other way around. Didn't want to disappoint, lowered the receiver and switched to my stage voice. Hello, young man, Clancy boomed. Glad you caught me before I left town. I waited to be asked about coming to his birthday party or for a balloon twisted into a Luke Skywalker lightsaber the next time I visited his class. Instead, he said, Clancy, can I go with you and live in Smallville? I cranked up my usual patter, how Smallville was a place in his heart he could visit when he was sad or afraid. But you're real, Clancy. His plea chilled my spine, sent Clancy reeling. Then the child shared. No food in the house, hiding in closets, belt buckle beatings. Clancy promised to help, hung up, wept. I called the school counselor, watched as he was placed in foster care. For years, Clancy searched for this boy at school events, visited with stuffed animals when he was sick. He never asked to live in Smallville again, but he ate dirt cake from the town's bake shop and learned how to plant donut seeds. And like the Velveteen Rabbit, the clown learned. A child made her real.
Nice.
I was there the week after that happened, visiting, and
Yeah.
she just wept telling me the story. Okay. I'll read Triptych and then I'll read Deconstructing Goldilocks, and y'all can use what you want, okay?
Okay.
A triptych on my a, tr- okay. A triptych on the first anniversary of my mother's death in memory of Dorothy Eloise Royal Luke. What's heaven like? Mama asked 3 weeks before she died. She was sitting on a red couch, frail, her eyes closed. Light through the picture window streaked her white hair gold. I recall tales of paved streets and pearly gates, said, I don't know, but it must be wonderful, full of love. Earth's pretty wonderful too, she replied. Mama had come from the womb of a cripple, a miracle declared spinster aunts who asked for the child if it lived but predicted the death of both. How my grandmother, failed by a stroke when her belly was ripe, gave birth and then lived 30 years to see me born is a mystery. Rocking on the front porch to ease her pain, Grandma would fret over her yard, then rise, hobble down the steps, dragging a straw broom behind, and with one hand sweep the South Georgia sand, tracing patterns that rose in her head like lines drawn by Navajo medicine men and Zen masters she never knew. Satisfied, winded from her work, she would limp back up the stairs, collapse into her chair, and dare anyone to desecrate the designs. Mama would bake cakes when she was upset, swirling divinity icing into patterns reminiscent of her mother's swept sand yard. The night she died, kin and caregivers surrounded her bed, recited the 23rd Psalm to bid her farewell. We dressed her corpse in a blue nightgown, sang gospel songs, lowered the coffin into the ground. Sun strikes the bench where I sit staring at winter grass that carpets her grave, dates etched in marble's blue veins. A sandpiper prances nearby. Love blankets me just as it covered Mama the night she left her body for us to bury, just as it warmed my grandmother when she edged toward death, then returned to bear life.
Mm. Nice.
And a fun poem. I did have fun. The hopscotch poem was fun. Yeah, okay. Deconstructing Goldilocks. Ugly old woman or girl with fair hair, lost in the woods or lured into the forest. Whichever version of the tale you choose, the chair breaks, the broth spills, and the bed is filled with a babe who does not belong there in that room with those bears. And no matter how many homes one peers into, none are just right. And many a mother has told a daughter, it doesn't matter if your bed is too soft or too hard. If you make it, you have to lie in it. And lie in it Goldilocks did through 2 centuries, as bards altered her from hag into naughty child with silver then golden hair, and then into a lass eating porridge, plumping pillows, because too many stories featured nasty old crones. And the once frightful tale of a mother rescuing her daughter from grizzlies became a damsel longing for hearth, dating one man too hot, another too cold, a third just right, until she wakes in his bed, jumps from the story, and exits through a window that has always been open.